Hello everyone, this is Ronnie with another video about the raw vegan diet, and today we'll talk about the mistakes that raw vegans are still making. Raw vegans still make these mistakes after all these years. The raw food diet has been a concept that makes a lot of sense, and in the past people really didn't get a lot of chance to experiment with their diet that much. There wasn't really a lot of ability to do that. You kind of ate what you ate regarding, depending on where you lived, what was available to you. Most people are very poor. They didn't have enough food. They ate whatever they could. And that was probably the state for many thousands of years, maybe many millions of years for human beings. Who knows exactly, but we ate what we could get our hands on, what we could grow, what was alive, you know. But at least in the 20th century, and maybe a little bit in the 19th century, more and more people had options in terms of what they ate. And there was more abundance of food, and the price of food came down as a proportion of people's income. And people had a greater deal of freedom in the Western world, at least, to start experimenting and changing their diet and eating more and eating differently. And the biggest trend was people were able to eat more. And obesity started to occur slowly. People started to become overweight for the first time ever. Lots of people were becoming overweight. It wasn't just a very small amount of people that were capable of doing that, but many people became overweight. And then we started to see a huge amount of various diseases pop up as a result of obesity, but also just as a result of the effects of poor diet. So all these diseases of lifestyle started to pop up and started to become the most dominant forms of why people died. And we'd got rid of a lot of the other diseases. We'd got rid of a lot of the other problems. We'd got rid of malnutrition mostly, and we got rid of, in the developed world, we got rid of a lot of the diseases that were waterborne because we had plumbing systems and things like that. So we were able to create a world in which, a lot of these other problems were no longer a problem. Surgery improved. People's ability to recover from trauma improved in terms of wounds and cuts and accidents and all that kind of stuff. But diseases of lifestyle became the predominant way that people died. But not only died, but they became a huge burden on people's lives. It's not just about your cause of death, it's about the fact that people lived with a reduced vitality. And the raw food diet is something that must have always made sense to people, whether they were able to do it or not. Because if we observed animals in nature, we would say, well, they don't cook their food, they don't wear clothing, they don't do all these things. Maybe we should be able to do that. There's just that thought that was probably always of interest to people. However, humans were generally seen historically as being different to animals and really not animals. Humans were always seen as different. And then when we had like Charles Darwin and different people like that talking about evolution, all of a sudden things changed. And people started to see humans as being an animal, and therefore, bound by the same laws as all animals. And at the same time, there was always even within religion, there was a hearkening back, a reaching back to a time where people lived in a state of nature, lived as animals, lived naked in the Garden of Eden. It's even in most of the old religions. So the concept must have always been floating around. Most people were never able to experiment with it because they didn't have access to much food that could have been, because bread and things like that were the main staples of life. So the concept of the idea would have maybe been around. The ability to do it would have been limited. But then coming into the 20th century, 19th century a little bit, people had more access to more different types of food. And at the start of the 20th century, you start to see the idea being spread a little bit more in various ways. And there are raw food groups going back to over 100 years ago. You can actually find menus of various societies and places that got together and shared this idea and ate raw foods together. I've got a menu from 1920, I think, or 1914 or 15. You know, and they ate raw foods. They were eating raw food and spreading the idea of raw food, and you get the first raw food sort of books and literature back then, because people were getting sick very quickly. It wasn't like heart disease took a while and all these diseases took a while. Like, people were getting sick really quick, you know, and there'd always been these illnesses as well. But because people were living in such poverty and had so little access to you know, didn't have the abundance of food and things like that, their main problems were not these diseases in some ways. They had such a hard life in many ways that there was so many other issues. And potentially their diet was much more vegetarian and much more vegan. And so potentially a lot of those the lifestyle diseases didn't happen so much. I would imagine that would be the case as well. So you've got all those kind of situations going on. The idea of raw food, I don't know who was the first. There's definitely people in Germany that were setting up sanatoriums and health places where people were coming to live a healthier life. There were fruitarian hospitals, but they didn't eat just fruit, but they were called fruitarian hospitals. There were books, definitely back then, 150 years ago perhaps, around the concept. There was the hygienist doctors of America. They're starting in the 19th century. Whether there was any even before that, probably. And then you go back to even ancient Greece, and there was doctors that were telling people to fast. So who knows exactly when the concept really took place? I'm not sure, if we're going back in the hundreds of years, what the public attitudes were towards diet and lifestyle. I'd imagine that people didn't really question it. They just ate what they could. People weren't educated. There was no like ability to sort of read books because people weren't able to read. So where would you get all your information or education from? Just basically from people around you, your family, superstition, and the church. Whatever the church told you would be the main way that people got information. There weren't really schools. I mean, when did schools start properly? When did healthcare start properly? Was there even the ability for mass kind of the mass spread of information? You know, now we've got TV, radio, internet, but back then, how did the king, for example, get a message out to many people? Well, they'd be able to write things, but people couldn't read, so they distribute things. So I guess it would be through the churches. I don't exactly know. So it's a kind of fascinating thing. Maybe someone should look into all that a bit more. But basically, you got this raw food idea, and what was the problem? It sounds like a good idea, right? Okay, the reason that people are unhealthy was because we're eating processed food and cooked food, and we're doing all this stuff to food. We're eating the wrong diet, and if we look to nature, all the animals don't develop heart disease and all these diseases, and they seem to be healthier, and they just eat this natural diet. So maybe humans have a natural diet. It seems to make sense, right? And the idea of raw food is always making sense. But people continue to made mistakes with it and continue to make mistakes with it, and it's the same mistakes as far as I can see. It's the same mistakes. So the biggest mistake people make with the raw food diet, well, not focusing on fruit. Fruit has to be really the focus. What you really are looking to do is, with raw foods, is replace your carbohydrate source. If you're going to change your diet, you need to change your carbohydrates. And fruit is the source of carbohydrates. And I think the reason that people struggle with that is because they don't associate sweets with a meal. They don't associate the taste of sweet with an actual meal of food. So they've associated throughout their life savory as a big meal, you know. And when we start to do a raw food diet, that has to change. We have to accept that fruit is actually a meal. So that's the first mistake. People aren't focusing on fruit. And there's still people that are trying to do a raw food diet that aren't focusing on fruit. There are raw foodists, long-term raw foodists that just will not accept that fruit is the way to do it. And they either aren't able to stick to raw, or they do it in such a way that they're always kind of flip-flopping around. Like they go on these higher fat diets, and then they have to go on like a juice cleanse, and then they're always chopping and changing, trying to figure things out. And if they just focused on fruit, they would do much better, you know. So not focusing on fruit, but then simply, even if you do focus more on fruit, not eating enough fruit. You need to eat enough fruit. You need to eat enough calories, full stop. But fruit should be making up the vast proportion, and sweet fruit should be making the vast portion of your calories. Very easy to make that mistake of not eating enough fruit. Not eating enough sweet fruit and ending up going towards the higher fat foods. And that's really the third mistake, is just eating too much fat. Ending up eating too much fat, too much avocados, too much nuts, seeds, too much oils. Really, if you want to be optimally healthy, oil shouldn't be in your diet at all. Any kind of oil, olive oil, coconut oil, and all that stuff. So these are the main problems of raw foods. And most people would do quite well with a raw food diet if they just focused on those things, and didn't really do anything else. Didn't experiment with any other factor, but just ate more fruit, focused on fruit, ate enough fruit, and limited their fat intake. These are the biggest mistakes people make. For beginners, the biggest mistakes are not eating enough fruit, eating too much fat. For people that are long term, the problems are eating too much fat. That's probably the main thing mistake they make. But still, sometimes under eating for people that are long term. I personally think the most long term people still don't focus enough on fruit. Even the people that do focus on fruit, I think too many people have an idea or an attitude that greens are like an essential part of the diet. I don't think they're essential, really. I think they're an additional part of the diet. I don't think they're a supplement to fruit. I think they are something that people might enjoy eating, and a different texture and flavour, but I do not see them as something that supplements or adds nutrients that fruit doesn't have, because that's not true. Fruit has all the same nutrients that greens have. Do have it in different proportions, but the primary thing about fruit that makes it the superior food to greens for human beings is that fruit is a higher source of calories, and human beings just don't have the capacity or the desire to eat enough greens to survive on. And so the idea that greens are the healthiest food is just craziness, because whoever's saying that must be including something else in their diet that gives them the calories that they need to stay alive, while they glorify greens. And greens are all around us, but none of us want to eat them. We're literally living in a world of greens. Leaves, grass, bushes, trees, whatever, moss. But we don't eat any of them. We don't bend down and eat the grass, So greens are not an ideal food for us, really. And I personally have not really, I'd like to investigate this more, but my feeling on it, my instinct on it, is that greens are not as important as people make out. They're not an essential part of the diet. That's my instinct on it. But a lot of people would disagree with me on that. A lot of people. So I I just I just think sometimes when people talk about greens and you say, well, why do you say they're essential? And they say, because I feel better when I have them. What does that mean? It's nothing. There's not any kind of scientific thing about. There's there's a theoretical thing that if we use the numbers that we need, that we're told that we need to stay healthy of particular nutrients, then greens or vegetables in general help us get those, and that fruit might be a little low in those. And that's the way that people kind of make that calculation. But it's not backed up with any real evidence. And the fact is that a person could have an unhealthy diet and meet all their mineral levels and all that, and vitamin levels, and still get really unhealthy. So because they have an excess. So that's as far as I can see, it's another problem. I think that a lot of people don't realize that a lot of people that have jumped off of the raw vegan diet, they were raw and then all of a sudden they're not raw, and they go back to eating meat and things like that. You got to realize a lot of these people were inconsistent. They didn't do raw 2 years, 3 years, 100%. They did raw a couple of months on and off, going back to vegan. They're the kind of people that you see posting that are saying, we need to be flexible with our diet. We need to be balanced. We need to be easy on ourselves. If I want to have a pizza now again, I'm going to do it. You know, these kind of posts that people put out, what they're really saying is, I'm inconsistent with my raw vegan diet. I'm inconsistent. I do it for some times and then I stop doing it. And it's not by choice, it's because they can't keep doing it. And they can't keep doing it because they have cravings and strong cravings to eat cooked food, basically addictions to cooked food. That's why they can't maintain the raw food diet, because they've not dealt with their cravings. And how do you deal with your cravings? Only by giving up cooked food long enough for them to go away. It's the only way it works. There isn't really any great kind of trick to it. But generally what happens is people experiment on and off and on and off. And if you're honest, and the problem with addiction is people are rarely honest with themselves. That's the problem with addiction. They can't see the wood for the trees or whatever, so they're getting addicted. They get addicted to whatever's in cooked food, and they say, oh, this is just as good as raw food, and it's not, obviously. Or bread is just as good as fruit. Or potatoes, I feel no difference eating potatoes than eating fruit. And you're like, how can that be the case? It's obviously different. It's obviously different. So what tends to be the case is people go back and forth and back and forth, and they get to a point where eating the cooked food makes them, they very strongly feel they're not feeling as good anymore, and they eventually make the decision to stick with fruit, stick with raw food. But yeah, most of the people that you see that say these things, and they're going on and off and they're going back to cooked food and all that, they've been inconsistent, and they've probably been able to stick to it for somewhere in the region of 3 months. 2 months, 3 months, there's a lot of people that have done that. But it's not a lifestyle change. It's like a temporary, like, think about it over the course of your life. What's 2 months? It's not much. You've been eating cooked food the 2,000 other months of your life, or whatever months it is, 3,000 months of your life, and for 2 of those months you ate raw food. And you think that that's a good experiment to know what's the comparison. So it annoys me because I see those posts coming up all the time. I see people who are very enthusiastic about raw, and then all of a sudden they're kind of on this other side of it. But then you get people who seem to be really enthusiastic about raw, and you're like, oh. And you start to realize they're kind of more probably got a problem. Like they're they're not really a raw foodist. They're like they've got eating disorder issues, and they're sort of hiding it, and that's a problem as well. So anyway, um, the best place to learn if you want to learn more, come to the one of the fruit festivals. I run the UK Fruit Fest. I'll put a link below if you want to check out more about that. And in general, I will probably see you in another video. You can join our Fruity Friday chats tomorrow night, and you can, yeah, feel free to put a question down below. Thank you very much.